Oi, seja bem-vindo de volta ao canal. Nesse vídeo aqui a gente vai falar sobre hábitos. Então eu vou te explicar tintim por tintim como é que funcionam os hábitos e como que você pode aplicar isso pros estudos. Mas antes de continuar, só quero deixar claro que esse daqui não sou eu. E se você estiver gostando desse conteúdo, assiste ele até o final. Não se esquece de deixar um like, um comentário com as suas dúvidas e sugestões. E claro, se inscreve no canal e ativa o sininho para ajudar no meu trabalho aqui. Vamos lá. Um vídeo bem direto, tá? Eu não gosto de enrolação não. Primeira coisa, o que é um hábito? É basicamente alguma coisa que você vai fazer constantemente e você não tem que se esforçar para fazer aquilo. É uma ação que surge naturalmente para você, né? Sem o esforço, sem você ter que usar a parte lógica ou emocional até da sua mente, você consegue fazer algo que deve ser feito, tá? A gente pode dividir o hábito em 3 etapas. A gente pode entender o hábito e a criação do hábito por essas 3 etapas. Gatilho, ação e recompensa. Eu acho que muitos de vocês já devem ter ouvido, se você não ouviu, agora é a hora. E eu vou explicar essas 3 etapas com uma coisa bem comum por aí, certo? Que é o ato de você fumar. Um vício também é um hábito. Então, como que acontece? Quando a pessoa que fuma, geralmente ela tem um gatilho que dá nela a vontade de fumar. Então, por exemplo, ela fica ansiosa, ela fica entediada, nervosa. E esse gatilho ativa a vontade de fumar. Então, existe uma ação que é o ato de você fumar. E quando a pessoa fuma, ela é recompensada, então ela se sente bem, né? Ela sente alguma coisa que eu não sei o que é porque eu não fumo, e aí acontece uma associação. Ela entende que quando ela está ansiosa, ela vai lá e fuma e ela melhora, ela se sente melhor, né? Então ela associa essas 3 etapas e com isso surge a criação de um hábito. Se ela ficar repetindo isso daqui sempre, fica ansiosa, sei lá, acontece alguma coisa, está nervosa, ela fuma, se sente bem, fica nervosa, fuma, se sente bem, isso cria na mente, né? Isso é gravado num lugar da nossa mente, na glândula, sei lá o que. Não sei qual é o nome do lugar, não sou bom com nomes. Enfim, isso fica gravado num lugar no seu cérebro especial que é um lugar onde você não tem que pensar ou raciocinar sobre as coisas. É uma coisa que se torna automático dentro de você. Por isso que é difícil de lidar com vícios e também é difícil de quebrar hábitos, né? Então isso aqui também serve para os estudos. Pode deixar aquele ali. O que acontece? Geralmente a pessoa se sente pressionada, né? Você tem que estudar, o tempo está passando, né? Já é julho, você ainda não estudou. Então ela tem um gatilho. Né? Hoje é segunda-feira, então já é hora de estudar. E aí é o gatilho, a pessoa vai lá e ela estuda, ela tenta estudar, né? Então ela abre o livro, tenta estudar, faz exercícios, erra os exercícios, não consegue aprender, procrastina. E qual que é a recompensa no final de tudo isso aqui? O que ela sente no final? Né? Ela se sente mal, sente uma merda. Ok? E é basicamente por isso que o hábito de estudar não funciona para muitas pessoas, porque a recompensa final não é positiva para a gente. Tá sendo uma recompensa negativa, tá vendo? Então a pessoa associa o estudo, uma coisa ruim, o estudo, né? Ela se sente mal, então vira tudo uma coisa ruim que ela acaba tentando evitar. Então todos os dias você evita estudar, você evita aprender porque você associou com coisas ruins, ok? Vamos explicar melhor isso daqui. Quando a gente fala de associação, né? A associação acontece principalmente entre o gatilho e a ação. A gente vai associar esse gatilho e ação. Nosso grande objetivo é fazer isso daqui, criar uma âncora para a nossa ação. Então, por exemplo, sempre que der tal hora, eu estudo. Ou, sei lá, quando acontecer, depois que eu escovar os dentes, eu estudo. Então, a gente vai associar essas duas coisas para criar o hábito. Então, como é que funciona isso daqui? Por exemplo, quando você sente fome, você come, certo? Você tem um gatilho, que é a fome, e você vai lá e você come, é a ação. Quando você acorda, geralmente o que você quer? Você quer alguma coisa para te estimular, para você acordar. Então, você pega o celular e olha o celular. E quando bate algum horário, se você assiste, sei lá, novela, né? Bateu tal horário da novela, você fala, opa, é hora da novela, hora do programa tal. Você vai lá e assiste TV. Acho que isso aqui não é tão comum mais porque a gente tem internet, né? Então a gente... Mas é só um exemplo. Então a gente associa o gatilho a uma ação. Daí como é que funciona essa associação? Basicamente, ela vai funcionar através da recompensa. Então, quando você tem fome, você come um lanche, você se sente bem depois. Então você entende, seu cérebro entende o quê? Quando você está nessa situação tal, esse gatilho, e você faz isso daqui, deu certo, né? Deu tudo ok, você se sentiu bem, você resolveu o problema. Agora, por exemplo, se você está com fome, você faz exercícios, e você vai lá e você sente mais fome ainda, você sente, sua barriga dói, você se sente mal, né? O que acontece? Seu cérebro entende que quando você tem fome, você não deve fazer exercício. né? Naturalmente, seu cérebro vai buscar uma resposta para cada tipo de gatilho que acontecer na sua vida. Então, você está feliz, vai acontecer alguma ação. Você está triste, vai acontecer uma ação. Você está com fome, isso. Você está ansioso, isso. Então, seu cérebro, ele vai marcando e vai associando essas coisas, entende? E o grande lance do hábito é isso. Você aproveitar esses gatilhos que já acontecem naturalmente no seu dia para você criar ações, né, que sejam benéficas para você, ok? Então, por exemplo, você ficou ansioso, você pode fumar ou você pode, sei lá, fazer alguma outra atividade menos prejudicial e que vai te dar um resultado positivo. E aí você associa ansiosidade, sei lá, fazer 10 polichinelos, pronto, deu certo, você se sentiu melhor, né? Se você consegue fazer essa associação, você quebra o hábito, o vício, e você cria um hábito melhor. Aliás, vamos só para fazer uma pausa aqui no conteúdo. Muita coisa daqui que eu estou falando vem de duas fontes principais. Uma delas é o livro O Poder do Hábito, né, que é um livro referência sobre hábitos. E também tem um site, eu não sei se existe ainda, estou até procurando aqui nesse exato momento, que é o zenhabits.net. Só que é um blog em inglês e basicamente ele fala sobre hábitos. É um cara que parou de fumar, trocando, fazendo exatamente isso que eu falei, né? Ele tinha gatilhos, ele trocou a ação de fumar por outra coisa. Então ele fazia uma corrida, né, de 5 minutos, sempre que ele sentia que estava algum gatilho ativando a vontade de fumar. E ele parou de fumar assim, trocando isso daqui, e ele criou esse blog que é o Zen Habits. E outra pausa, né, para divulgar outra coisa, que é o curso Gabaritei, que é o meu curso de aprendizado. Cadê minha cara? Que é meu curso de aprendizado, onde eu ensino sobre hábitos, eu ensino sobre produtividade, sobre como você faz para aprender e métodos de estudo nele. É basicamente o nosso canal do YouTube aqui, só que com esteroides. É um curso completamente organizado que vai te direcionar e vai te ajudar nos estudos. Se você tiver interesse, o link está aqui na descrição e o curso também ajuda a fazer esse trabalho aqui no YouTube e continuar, né, sendo gratuito. Vamos lá. Cadê? Tá em recompensa? Ok. Então, o que acontece? Uma coisa que as pessoas não entendem é o seguinte. Feedback, ele pode ser positivo ou negativo. O que é um feedback? É a recompensa final, né? É o retorno que você está tendo pelaquela atividade. E esse feedback pode ser positivo ou negativo. E ele acontece só no final do nosso ciclo aqui de ações. Então, por exemplo, deu um horário, deu 10 horas da manhã, é o horário da academia. Você vai lá na academia, você faz os exercícios. Depois que você fez os exercícios, que você tem que firmar uma recompensa, um feedback positivo para você entender que bateu o horário, você fez exercícios e isso é bom. Então, por exemplo, você vai lá, você vê na balança que você perdeu algum peso. Você toma um shake gostoso. Você se sente bem. Você libera naturalmente endorfina, serotonina e um monte de outros hormônios e neurotransmissores. Então, você se sente bem e você associa que se você faz exercício todo dia naquele horário, você se sente bem. Nos estudos, né? O que acontece? Deu o horário dos estudos, sei lá, deu 10 horas da manhã, você marcou que você vai estudar, você vai lá e você estuda. E quando você estuda, o que você tem que fazer? O importante não é o estudo ser uma coisa legal, interessante, divertida. O estudo não tem que ser uma coisa boa, entende? A atividade, a ação não tem que ser legal. O que tem que ser bom é o resultado final, a recompensa. Então você vai fazer o quê? Você vai pensar, pô, mais um passo dado. Matei um assunto hoje, falta só 10, sei lá. Eu consegui aprender alguma coisa nova. O que eu aprendi? Foi isso. Mesmo que seja uma coisa pequena, valoriza esse aprendizado, né? Então, se você tiver um feedback positivo depois, você vai associar o horário, os estudos, uma coisa constante que vai acontecendo algo positivo na sua vida, né? Agora, diferente de você fazer o quê? Criar um feedback negativo. Então, por exemplo, o que é um feedback negativo? É você bater o horário, você vai lá, você estuda. E aí você pensa, depois do estudo ou durante até, nossa, como eu sou burro, não estudei nada, perdi meu dia, queria ter jogado videogame hoje, fiquei estudando, tive que ficar estudando, entende? Você acabou de associar que o estudo, né, em relação a esse gatilho aqui, é uma coisa negativa. E se é negativo, você tem que evitar. Já viu como a gente faz para adestrar cachorro, por exemplo? Quando você quer que ele faça alguma coisa direito, ele faz o negócio e você vai lá e dá um biscoitinho. Se ele fez alguma coisa errada, também tem um jeito de você dar uma bronca nele, você mostrar para ele que tá errado, né? Ele fez xixi no lugar errado, você pega a cabeça dele e faz ele cheirar, né? O xixi ali, você dá uma bronca e faz ele cheirar para ele entender. Ele associa que fazer xixi no sofá é ruim, e ele associa que fazer xixi no jornal é uma coisa boa, porque ele ganha alguma coisa boa, entende? E é isso que você tem que criar nos estudos para você. Você simplesmente vai e cria esse feedback. E uma coisa que as pessoas não entendem é que isso acontece também de forma cíclica e num nível micro, não só macro. Então, a gente pode entender até que o gatilho é igual à recompensa. Então, por exemplo, você estuda um parágrafo, você lê um parágrafo. Nessa leitura de um parágrafo, o que passa na sua cabeça? Se você se sente bem, você fala, caramba, então quer dizer que o capitalismo surgiu desse jeito, não sei o que lá, e você se interessa, isso aqui gera o quê? Um feedback positivo para a leitura desse parágrafo. E esse feedback positivo, esse interesse, essa curiosidade, gera, né, se torna também um gatilho para você continuar lendo o próximo parágrafo. Então você se sente curioso, você quer saber mais, você lê mais um parágrafo. Você lê mais um parágrafo, você se sente bem, você aprendeu alguma coisa, rola mais curiosidade, você lê mais um pouco. Então você faz um ciclo onde você vai sempre querendo estudar mais e aprender mais. Isso se torna uma coisa natural para você. Agora vamos pensar como é que, depois de assistir esse vídeo aqui, eu quero que você faça o seguinte, você reflete como que você tem feito. Eu sei que a maioria das pessoas não consegue fazer isso daqui. Então pensa o que está acontecendo, reflete, analisa. O que está acontecendo no seu estudo, tá? Geralmente você vai fazer o quê? Você vai estudar, você vai ler um parágrafo e aí você vai ficar entediado. Você não vai se interessar no assunto. Você vai falar, nossa, sei lá, você começa a pensar em outra coisa, né? E isso já é um feedback negativo para essa ação. Ou seja, seu cérebro ele já quer quebrar esse ciclo aqui. Então isso daqui já vai meio que sumir, ok? Então aqui você vai ter um feedback negativo, né? Vamos pintar de vermelho, sei lá. Tem um feedback negativo, tem um feedback negativo, você já não quer mais ler. Você já perdeu o interesse. Você já quebra, né, o ciclo de um micro hábito, digamos assim, na hora de você estudar. Então não é só uma questão de você enxergar o estudo como se fosse uma coisa que você vai fazer todos os dias, naturalmente. O hábito ele também se aplica à forma como a sua mente funciona, né? Se a sua mente entende que estudar não é legal na hora, você cria esse tipo de pensamento negativo, você não consegue continuar repetindo a ação de estudar, de pesquisar, de fazer exercícios, entende? Então, você tem que entender, quanto melhor você entender isso daqui, quanto melhor você conseguir analisar, então não é só uma questão de você enxergar o estudo como se fosse uma coisa que você vai fazer todos os dias, naturalmente. O hábito ele também se aplica à forma como a sua mente funciona, né? Se a sua mente entende que estudar não é legal na hora, você cria esse tipo de pensamento negativo, você não consegue continuar repetindo a ação de estudar, de pesquisar, de fazer exercícios, entende? Então, você tem que entender, quanto melhor você entender isso daqui, quanto melhor você conseguir analisar e quanto melhor você conseguir agir no meio dos seus estudos para transformar isso daqui, melhor. Então o que você tem que fazer? Se você tem esse feedback negativo, você tem que começar a substituir ele, né? Trocar ele por um cara positivo. Se conseguir transformar isso daqui, como você faz isso daqui, aí já é uma outra história, né? Mas se você conseguir transformar isso daqui, o que você vai conseguir fazer? Você vai conseguir estudar mais e mais de forma natural, sem ter que se esforçar, sem parecer que é um negócio forçado, sem parecer que dói estudar. Tá? Então, é basicamente isso daqui, uma teoria inicial para a gente começar a trabalhar com os hábitos, beleza? Então, o vídeo vai ficando por aqui, não se esqueça, o curso Gabaritei aqui no link da descrição e vídeos novos todas as terças e quintas aqui no canal.
Everyone is a student including you. Lifelong learning is a life skill essential for making progress. Everyone is a student, including you. Lifelong learning is a life skill essential for making progress towards your goals, discovering new things, and ultimately finding yourself. And right now in this moment, I have to study for the education system, as I'm sure many of you have to as well. I'm Korean, and Korea is notorious for the 16 hours of studying a day, preschool lessons, post-school lessons, homework, literally learning how to lucid dream just so you can cram more than the 2 hours of sleep that your mum lets you get. But thankfully I escaped. From the country, yes, but from my parents, no. And I think throughout the years I've built up enough knowledge to call myself somewhat of a studying expert. And I won't deny at school I am that guy. The guy that everyone hates because they seem to do well no matter what. The Asian who everyone calls having a no life, rice eating 20 hours a day studying, good at everything type of student. The Asian student. And not to toot my own horn or be arrogant, but I genuinely probably study the least in my class. And this is hard to digest because surely if you spend more time in something, the rewards will be directly proportional. But that's not the case. Throughout the years, I've tried a lot. Pretty notes, highlighting, Pomodoro technique, forest app, studying tips and tricks. And throughout this journey, I've learned a few things along the way. And whether you're an adult or you're 12 and just starting your learning journey, this video will be valuable to all. Because to be able to study effectively and efficiently is the key in not only enjoying the studying aspect, but also getting the progress to make your parents proud. So this is how to study, made for students, made by a student. Firstly, you have to let go of the thought you have in your mind that time studied equals knowledge gained. You've seen and heard it everywhere, especially in Asia. How many hours does your child study? I study for 12 hours for this test, and it's like a propaganda machine. Because not only does this cause severe depression, but it's also shown to be extremely ineffective. It's like in the gym, doing 3 sets to failure is better than doing 12 sets. It's like it's better to use LED lights than filament bulbs because they're more efficient. It's like, okay, you get the message. Sometimes less is more. And as cool as it sounds to please your Asian parents or to flex on your friends that you studied for 10 hours a day, the smartest students know how to practice deep work. And deep work refers to a state of peak concentration that lets you learn hard things and create quality work quickly. It's essentially decreasing studying time but increasing results. And this sounds so magical and golden, right? Being able to only study for 2 hours a day but have a more fulfilling and more efficient session. But deep work is just a concept and is very general, and there are many steps like stepping stones that you need to cross in order to fully utilize them. Okay, so the first step we have to do is to apply a principle. It's called the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule, because we've already established that you're going to drastically cut down the amount of time you spend studying into, let's call it 2 hours a day. So if you only had 2 hours a day to study, what would you do? You wouldn't make pretty notes and highlighting them. This is the part of the 80%. Sure, these help, but considering the amount of help, ROI, investment return you get, these aren't worth doing. Instead, you're better off focusing on this 20% that will give you the 80% of the results. So you would do practical past paper questions and topic questions, because in the end, the questions are what's going to be on the test and what they're going to be asking. And making notes is good. My form of studying for the longest time was rewriting notes by hand into this notebook, so that by the end I would have rewritten the whole topic. And obviously this does work to some extent, but not only is it inefficient, it doesn't actually prepare you for the exam itself, because you just learn the content, but exam technique is half of the equation. And this inefficiency becomes blatant when you think about the fact that when you write these notes, you're writing on everything, so you're not able to target weaknesses, and you ignore the fact that you probably already know a good chunk of this, so you end up wasting time. And so that's why past papers, topic questions are so valuable, because you get to see where your gaps in the topic are, and then you consolidate those gaps with knowledge. And then you also get to see the mark scheme, which is the model answer for you to look at and memorize. And there are many sites, and I personally use PMT and Save My Exams. And I realized that the reason I was writing these notes is that you feel like you've done a lot, because when you copy the notes and you get 3, 4, 5 pages worth of notes, you have this tangible physical evidence that you tell yourself, damn, I've studied really hard, I've got 5 pages worth of notes. Whereas in fact, that doesn't amount to knowledge. And whereas if you do past papers or topic questions, you don't actually get a physical, tangible piece of work that you've completed, so it doesn't feel like you've actually studied. And the agent secret, I'm spilling it right now, is that you just spam these topic questions, past papers, until, for example, you have a biology test and they just become easy, like times table questions. What's 8 times 7? 56. What's the powers of the cell? Mitochondria. What's the bacteria cell? God damn. And okay, if you're in higher education, towards A-level or university, I appreciate that memorizing everything like times table isn't going to work, but the principle of doing past paper questions, topic questions, specific questions, instead of just writing the notes, is a principle that you can agree with, and that's proven to be effective. And the next section is about distractions. Distractions are like kryptonite to students, bane to the arthropods, social interactions to emos. Okay, you get it. You can all relate. You try and sit down and focus, but the distractions are always there. The best way to avoid distractions isn't to cut them out. Although in an ideal world, you could just go cold turkey and cut out video games, all these distractions out of your life. But I appreciate how hard it is in this day and age for you to just go on your phone and delete all social media apps. So we can't get rid of them fully. So then how do we stay focused when we have to work? It's simple. You just delay it. You tell yourself you'll do 2 hours of deep work, and then after that you could spend the day watching Netflix, guilt-free, because we all know that worst feeling is when you're watching Netflix but you still have that exam you haven't studied for. But you have to promise yourself that the condition is you have to do those 2 hours fully, 100% focused and distraction free, and only if you do that you're going to promise yourself that you're going to enjoy Netflix, social media afterwards. Because if you can truly focus in those 2 hours and do 2 hours worth of deep work, it's more valuable than a whole day's worth of work. And this works for some people and not for others. I appreciate that. If you can completely cut out your bad habits, go for it. So while you're doing deep work, full screen Word or whatever you're doing, turn off the Wi-Fi, bury your phone in a hole. I don't know. Make sure there's no things that can distract you and that you can just focus on your work. And of course this isn't going to work straight away. We've grown up in a world of distractions, and distractions are ever more prevalent. And I still mindlessly autopilot onto YouTube while working and just waste time. But it's a work in progress, and tell yourself that you want to get to the stage where you can focus fully for these 2 hours. In an ideal world we will cut everything up, but as I've talked about, this isn't something that can just be done overnight. And the third and last one is to be precise. Set a goal for your 2 hour study session, because 2 hours realistically is a very short time, especially if you're going to go from 6-8 hours down to 2. For example, I'm going to do plant reproduction in this 2 hour session. I'm going to do all the topic questions and make sure I don't have any gaps in my knowledge. This is a specific and smart target you're setting, and it doesn't have to only be one thing, but open up a notepad and write down the list of things you want to finish in that allocated set of time. Because goal setting in itself makes it so you're more likely to achieve all those goals. And if you go into the session head first without any idea what you're going to do, not only is that going to be a cause of distraction in yourself, it's going to take up a lot of time considering what you're going to do. Whereas if you sit down and know in your head what you're already going to do, it's so much easier for you to just get stuck in the task and focus. And the mistake that people make is that they vaguely say, oh, I'm going to study, and they start flicking through their textbook, wasting hour after hour. You must create specific targets, and by doing this, it's like you're a guided missile and you're absolutely going to decimate a specific area and nail that topic. And to conclude, studying is made to seem like this 10 hours a day, wow, yay, so cool type of thing, but it's not. I promise, if you learn how to utilize deep work, it will change your life, making it more fun, leaving time for other things, and also prevent you from feeling burnt out and exhausted from studying. So make sure to do practical focused study sessions of practice questions and distance yourself from
So let's get on to the meat of our business today, which is our next core idea segment, and I thought I would tackle the topic for which I am probably best known, which is deep work. So I'm known for deep work because of the book I published in 2016 of that same name. This was a book that had a bit of a quiet launch. It was a Wall Street Journal bestseller for a week or so, and that was just off of the strength of my email list audience at that time. And then it sort of went under the radar. And then a year or so later, something just started to happen. People kept buying it, and they started buying it at a higher rate than they did before. And it's a book that never actually had a week in which it was gangbusters. It never had a week in which it was number 2 on the charts on Amazon. It never had a Mark Manson or James Clear moment, but this book has quietly moved into almost 40 languages now. You can get this book in a lot of places. There is a Mongolian version of this book. We have a book being sold. There's a French-speaking Africa version of the book. It's a lot of places. It's also quietly sold in English, more than 1 million units. So it's out there. It's had an impact, but never loudly. It's a little background. So let's talk about deep work. Let's talk about it. Three things to cover here. Number 1, what is it? Number 2, why is it important? Number 3, how do you do it better? Those are the 3 key points if we're going to talk about deep work. So number 1, what is deep work? It is an activity. People often explode or expand this definition to cover all sorts of different things, entire lifestyles, whole value judgment systems about what work is important and what's not. Deep work is none of those things. It is a humble description for a very specific activity. It is when you are focusing without distraction on a cognitively demanding task. If you are doing that activity, you are doing deep work. Now let's unfold those 2 parts. The easy part of that is cognitively demanding. So you're working on something hard and you're thinking hard about it. There's a hard thing and you're thinking hard about it. That's the easy part of the definition. The more demanding part of the definition is that you're doing this without distraction. Now, what I mean by that more technically is that you are doing this cognitively demanding work in the absence of context shifts. Now, a context shift is when you turn the focus of your attention from one cognitive context to another. For a session to count as deep work, you cannot be doing those switches. So if you're working on something non-cognitively demanding, let's say you're trying to format properly a chart in PowerPoint, that's not cognitively demanding, that's not deep work. But let's say you are doing something cognitively demanding. You are trying to write a strategy memo. It's hard. You got to think about this. Like, what are we trying to say here? I have to say this just right. But let's say while you're writing the strategy memo, every 5 to 6 minutes, you quick check your email inbox. Or you glance at your phone to see what's going on. That session also does not count as deep work because you are doing these context shifts, which significantly degrades your cognitive effectiveness. So if you can avoid the shifts and you're working on something hard, you are doing deep work. Otherwise, you're either doing shallow work, which is work that's not cognitively demanding, or you're doing pseudo deep work, which is you're working on something hard, but you keep switching context, so you are at a fraction of your capability of producing clean thought. So that's all deep work is, a particular type of activity among many types of activities you might do during a typical workday. Number 2, why is it important? Well, I first want to make clear that there's not a moral hierarchy here. There is not an argument that the only type of work that matters is deep work. We know in almost any professional context, there's lots of other types of efforts that are critical for those efforts, right? If you are not properly invoicing your clients, which is not a deep activity, but if you are not properly invoicing your clients, you're going to get no money and your business is going to go out of business. A couple of years ago, I was, to give another example, the director of graduate studies for the computer science department here at Georgetown. And something we had to do each spring as part of that role is build a budget that talked about, for every doctoral student we have, where is the money coming from for the tuition, for the research assistantship, for the TA-ship, for the health insurance. We had to work out this budget, and there was nothing about this that was deep. It wasn't cognitively demanding. It was just a huge pain because, as you can imagine, it's complicated to untangle. This is coming from a grant, and this is coming from a fellowship, and this is coming from from the department funds. But you know what? Critically important work. Without it, the students don't get paid and they can't do what they're trying to do. So deep work is not, from a moral standpoint, the only work that matters. But in many professional contexts, and this was a core concept for my book, Deep Work, it is the deep efforts that move the needle. Ultimately, the activity that produces the value that allows you to keep doing what you're doing, that allows you to get promoted in what you're doing, that allows your company to grow or be more successful. Typically, these core activities are going to have a foundation of deep work. So it's what moves the needle. This is particularly clear in knowledge work where you're sitting at a computer screen all day. No one's going to pay your company for how quickly you answer emails. No one's going to pay your company because you are really rocking Zoom meeting after Zoom meeting. No one's going to pay you or give money to your company because you're jumping on calls. No one's going to pay you or your company because you're shooting around PowerPoint decks with rapid speed. What are they going to pay your company for in a knowledge work context? Adding value to information. This is almost always an effort of deep work, skilled thought on something. If it was not skilled thought or difficult, it would be easily replicatable and its value would plummet. You run the ad agency, there's a lot of stuff you have to do to keep the lights on, but it's coming up with the really good ad campaigns that gets you paid. You run the tech company, there's a lot you have to do to make sure that the code is released properly and marketed, but if you're not writing fantastic code that gives you a good, stable product, you're out of business. There's a lot that goes into marketing books, but if you're not writing fantastic book, it doesn't matter how much of that you're doing. So in knowledge work, shallow efforts keep the lights on, deep work moves the needle. It's important. It's at the core of what creates value. In other types of industries, this is even more clear. I mean, if you're an athlete, it's all about the deep efforts, the deep training and the deep performance. Training is a matter of deep work, focused incredibly intensely on what you're trying to do. Performing, you're on the court, you're on the field. Incredibly deep, focused effort, no distractions. So deep work is clearly what moves the needle there. See this in art, you see this in the skilled crafts. If I'm a elite woodworker, ultimately what matters more than anything else is am I producing beautifully made, very well constructed artifacts. So deep work is often what moves the needle. Not the only effort that matters, but it's what often moves the needle. The issue we got into, and this was the premise of the book Deep Work, the issue we have gotten into more recently is that we forgot that. And we began to think about all work being work. It's all equal. Either you're doing stuff or you're not, and if you're doing stuff and working hard, that's good, and if you're not doing stuff and working hard, that's bad. We stopped differentiating between deep work and shallow work. And why was this a problem? Because we had developments in the digital world. Tools like low-friction communication channels, email, Slack. We got highly distracting entertainment like YouTube and social media pulling out our attention from the phones. We got Zoom and PowerPoint slides and jumping on calls, and our work got more ambiguous. It became less clear exactly what it is that we do. And in this context, we fell into this mode where increasingly you could go through most of your day never actually concentrating hard without distraction. Most of your day is now on calls, in emails, on Zoom, changing those proverbial fonts and trying to get that chart to work in your PowerPoint slides. And we all patted ourselves on the back and said, look how busy we are. We're crushing it. We're getting after it. But we forgot that we weren't doing the actual underlying core deep work activities that was going to allow this company to keep existing in the first place. It's going to allow you to continue to keep your job in the first place. We were on the deck of the Titanic sending Instagram pictures of our deck chair arrangements, not even realizing that the ship underneath us was sinking. And so the core argument in the book is that is a problem, but it's also an opportunity. Because what we have is a situation where this really important thing is becoming more scarce. So guess what? If you are one of the few people to prioritize it, if you're one of the few organizations to prioritize it, you are going to get a disproportionate competitive advantage. If you prioritize depth in an increasingly shallow world, there is large reward that you are going to get. So we could see it as a negative. We are forgetting about deep work as we drown in the shallow, or you can see it as a positive. Everyone else is doing that, but I don't. And I'm getting wildly and disproportionately rewarded for that because, you know, the old saying, you don't have to be faster than a bear when you run into that grizzly in the park. You just have to be faster than the person who's there with you. bear will get him first. So that's why deep work is important. So what we need is to make sure that it's something that we prioritize and it has a good presence, an intentional presence in our working life. All right, so the third idea here is, how do we do that? How do we do deep work better? Well, that's most of my book. I have a keynote I've been giving for a long time where I spend 30 minutes going through examples about this. It's an endlessly rich topic. So let me just give you a sampling of some ideas here about what matters if you want to take advantage of this reality that deep work is valuable but becoming more scarce. One, just defining it is critical. The fact that we have terminology is at the core of any change. Just knowing deep work is different than shallow work allows you to actually say, oh, I see what we're trying to do here. Otherwise, the only knob you have to turn is work harder or not. Stay up later, be on your phone more. As soon as the plane lands, whip it out, do those emails. If you don't know what it is you're trying to do better, you're not going to actually do the right things better. So defining it is key. 2, you need to measure it and you need to have goals. One of the most important ideas from that book, I believe, was the deep to shallow work ratio. The concept is you figure out for your particular position, what is the ideal ratio of deep work hours to non-deep work hours in a standard work week? This will differ depending on your job, but you should know what the right answer is. And if you work for someone else, you should have this conversation with the person you work for, with your supervisor. Here's what deep work is. Here's what shallow work is. Both is important. We have to get the invoices out the door, but if I'm not producing good ad copy, we're not going to get any more money. What is the ratio in my job that I should do that will best serve this company? And you get a number, and then you measure. And if you already time block plan, you can just look straight on your time block plan for the week and see all the blocks that you've marked off as deep work blocks. It's easy to actually get these numbers, but you measure and you say, hey, here's how we're doing. You and I talked about this and said it should be 50-50. Guess what? I got 2 hours of deep work in last week. Because remember, it does not count as deep work if it is not hard and if it's not with zero distraction. Now you're confronting a clear number. We decided 50-50 would best serve this company. We're nowhere near 50-50. We either have to say, you know what, Cal? I don't want you to do any deep work, which is crazy because, again, that's what creates the value. Or you say we're going to have to make some changes. And then you get changes to the company culture. Then you get more flexibility. Your workload changes. It is a driver for change that comes from a place of positivity. If you work for yourself, do the same exercise. Here's the ratio. I'm going to hold myself to it. If I'm not hitting it, something has to change. Schedule your deep work time is another big one that's very important. Do not wait for the instinct to hit you. You know, I'm just in the mood to do some deep work and I have nothing to do. That's never going to happen. If that happens, you're not working hard enough. That's not something that's going to arise naturally. So you need to get it on your calendar one way or the other and treat it like you would any other meeting or appointment. That's time that is protected. That's time that you cannot overschedule. Have a philosophy for how you do this. Maybe it's the same time on the same days every week. Maybe instead when you do your weekly plan, it's more bespoke. Here's where I'm going to fit it in this week. Maybe you take one day a week where you do just deep work and the other days you don't. However you want to do it, but have a philosophy, schedule it, protect it. And if possible, have rituals surrounding these actual sessions that really helps your mind slip into the deep work mode. I do the same walk. I go to the same secondary office space. I make the very same cup of coffee in the same cup. Have a ritual. So your brain knows, oh, it's time to do deep work. Finally, you have to train this ability. Concentration is hard. If you look at your phone and every single piece of downtime you have, you are out of cognitive shape. You're a cognitive slob. And if you give yourself a 2-hour window and say, let's go do some deep work, that's like taking the guy who is in terrible shape and be like, look, man, we're going to run some stadiums. It's not going to go well. You are going to be distracted. It's going to be difficult. You are going to literally be sweating. You're like, this is terrible. And that's because you haven't trained. So don't give up if it's hard. That just means you haven't been on your virtual Peloton yet long enough to get those virtual lungs back in shape here. All right. So you have to train, which means you have to spend time free from distractions on a regular basis, read books because that forces your mind to concentrate, do productive meditation where you try to work on a professional problem just in your head as you walk. That is fantastic training. Board games, any type of strategy game where you have to think hard about it. do all these type of things. Complicated hobbies that require real focus and skill, be it manual or physical. You have to get your mind in shape if you're going to succeed at deep work. It's not enough just to say, I'm going to do it. You got to train for it. All right, so those are the main 3 ideas about deep work: what it is, why it's important, and how to get better at it. And I'm going to add a coda here that I think is also critically important, which is once you are doing these things, you have to work the word deep into your everyday conversation as a prefix and adjective absolutely as much as possible. That's how people know you're awesome, and people are going to think you're really cool if you do it. And that's my final piece of advice. You need to just walk in and be like, hey guys, Deep Monday, am I right? Yeah, it's going to get some a deep coffee break over there. No, you're doing a little deep urination. All right, good work with that. You come back, we'll deep it up, stay deep. Let's deep on over to the deep conference room, man. We're gonna go deep on these type of things. This is going to make you sound awesome, and people are going to love you. Jesse here will attest. Every time I see him, we fist bump and say, "Deeple meeple." You can attest to that. Just see each other in the street, "Deeple meeple." Let it explode. But if you're gonna do all this work, you gotta let people know. It'll make you, trust me, I know from personal experience, people love it when you use the word deep all the time and they think you're awesome.
Literally, why are we not taught how to study? When you need to learn a lot of literally why are we not taught how to study? When you need to learn a lot of information for school or university, it's so overwhelming to know where to start. There are so many studies to using flashcards that it's really hard to know what's actually a good use of your time. I want you guys to be productive queens, so today we are talking about what is the best study technique. I'm going to be ranking the most common study techniques from you're kind of wasting your time and you should be watching Netflix to my personal top tier ranking, casual magic, of course, where it's just so efficient that it feels like magic. Last year I wrote a book called The Only Study Guide You'll Ever Need, and I'm currently studying a degree in cognitive science. So the rankings in this video will be heavily based on a bunch of different evidence-based papers from the science of learning. Other criteria include efficiency. We've got lives to live, we don't want to be wasting time. Helping you remember content rather than understanding, because I feel like that's more where classes and lectures come in. And obviously my own experience and what has worked for me. Let's get into it. Okay, first we have blurting. A little bit biased because I helped come up with it, but this is my all-time favorite technique. This technique requires you to choose a topic that you want to learn, and you blurt down on a piece of paper everything that you can remember just from memory, so without notes. You can time yourself doing it, you can give yourself prompt words, and when you're finished, you compare whatever you've written to your actual notes. You can highlight what you got wrong, what you missed out, and very quickly you can see the gaps in your knowledge. It's so good. It uses active recall. The quality of your learning is literally so good from the time spent that it is almost magic. Now we have highlighting. I think we've just gone from the best to the worst. I am a sucker for a pastel highlighter, and I really appreciate all my aesthetic queens who are like me. But guys, you've been sold a lie in terms of how useful it is. Multiple papers in the cognitive science space has deemed highlighting as a low utility revision technique. It is a solid relegation to waste of time. Sorry, my aesthetic queens. Oh, now we have flashcards. This can be done on Anki, on Quizlet, or physical flashcards, and damn, this is like straight A-star worthy. Flashcards are so good because you can integrate active recall, you can integrate spaced repetition. There are so many platforms nowadays that make it easier. You can make them as hard or as easy as you like because you're choosing what goes on them. But I do think they can get repetitive and sometimes be time inefficient because you don't always know which ones you know really well and which ones you don't know as well. So it's not casual magic. It's a little bit repetitive, but it still gets you the A-star. Ooh, teaching others. A lot of papers rank self-explanation and teaching others as a mid-tier revision technique. It's good because you can prove that you do understand something, and the act of summarizing it to someone who is not familiar with the content is a really good practice for you, and it can definitely reveal gaps in your knowledge. However, is it really teaching you what's on the mark scheme? Are you really applying your knowledge in a new way? Is it definitely gonna get you an A-star? I don't know. So I'm gonna put decent. You should do it, but don't rely on it. Past papers. We love. So many science of learning papers rank practice testing as god tier, high utility. So It's gotta be an A star from me. Like, also in my personal experience, it's just so useful to see what an examiner actually wants, to learn from other people's essays, to go over mistakes that you have made, to apply your knowledge. We love her, but she's also a lot of effort and sometimes very time consuming. So it's not gonna be a casual magic, but it is gonna be very good grades. Spaced repetition, I feel like Ali Abdaal. This is more of a principle than a technique, and this principle is essential. You can feed it into any technique that you're using. The idea is you're using the forgetting curve of human memory to make sure that every time your knowledge of something is getting low, you're getting it back up to 100% again. Right now I'm learning Spanish, and when I'm learning some new vocabulary, obviously one day after I've gone over it, I can still kind of remember the words. 2 days after having seen it, I can still kind of remember the words. But about 1 week after having that Spanish lesson, my knowledge of those Spanish is if I keep going over that vocabulary at set intervals, I'm gonna make sure I'm getting it into my long-term memory. I think because this is a principle, it's got to be casual magic, because it literally feels like magic how just making a better use of time and interval practice can absolutely revolutionize the work that you're doing. Watching videos like you are right now. For me, this is like rewatching lectures, watching breakdowns on YouTube. I think this is so good for two things. It's amazing to help you understand something new, and it's amazing to inspire your curiosity about why this thing is cool. However, it is very bad for remembering stuff. How many YouTube videos have you watched and literally 2 days later you couldn't remember a single thing? It's like in one ear, out the other ear. So watching videos, it's got to be meh. It's not a total waste of time, but it's not gonna get you an A star on its own. The Pomodoro technique, we love her. She's gotten us through some unmotivated days. This is more of a productivity hack. It's basically the idea that you only spend 25 minutes studying and then you reward yourself with a 5-minute break after. And I think it's really good if you're struggling to get into a study flow. All you've got to do is commit to doing 25 minutes. Anyone can do that. And so I think it's decent. It's like really helpful to get you started studying, but then what you're doing in that time really matters to be getting the A star or the magic. Okay, making notes. I often see this as essential in a classroom environment. It can even help you keep your attention and focus in a lecture scenario because you are writing down things that are being said. But I think there's so much variation in what makes notes good or bad. Great notes are where you are making associations to past content. You're like, oh my God, this connects to something I learned 3 classes ago, because you're building this foundation of knowledge in your brain. And also using the Feynman technique where you write down questions for your future self. That's really good because you're quite active in the process of making your notes. However, if it's just like copying stuff down, you're just reciting what the teacher's saying, it's so passive that it's kind of a waste of time. So I'm gonna put making notes in meh, because I feel like a lot of the time it is kind of a waste of time, but they can be done well. Interleaving, this is basically the idea that you study one subject and then you change it up by studying something else before you come back to revisiting that initial subject. So rather than doing like maths for 10 hours, you could do maths for 20 minutes, then English language for 20 minutes, then French for 20 minutes, and then come back to the maths. And if you still remember it, then bam, you're doing quite well. Most cognitive science papers rank interleaving as a mid-tier, mid-utility technique, and I think I'm similar. Like, it's decent. It's kind of similar to the Pomodoro technique in it can help you shape your study practice, good grades. Listening to music, controversial. I think there are 2 things to take into account here. The first is efficiency of what you're learning, and the second one is fun. In terms of efficiency, there are a lot of studies that suggest that listening to music can actually even hinder your study practice, especially if it has words or vocals, because there's evidence that you'll be thinking about the words, the lyrics in the song. However, I do appreciate music enhances the fun. Like, I have a study playlist that if I want to get into the zone, I will listen to it, and it's just like habit. It's so lovely coming to my desk, listening to this thing that I've created for the certain moment of studying, and especially some lo-fi beats, some classical music, like that enhances the study process. And honestly, making studying fun is so important to you sticking with it and wanting to come back and do more. So I think listening to music is like, is it a decent or I'm gonna put it in meh. It's not giving you anything extra, but it can make the whole thing more fun. And finally, rereading notes or textbook. All the cognitive science papers say this is solid, low utility, waste of time. And I don't know about you guys, but this is the main technique that I used for the majority of secondary school. If no one teaches you how to study, then obviously you're going to assume that rereading the information is helping you. It makes you feel clever, it makes you feel like the information's in your head, but it really just doesn't do much for you. You need stuff which is active, like pulling stuff out of your brain. Okay, so this is the final tier ranking. Obviously this is just my opinion, having read a lot on the topic and just having a lot of stuff to learn at university. And I think an important point to note is there's a big difference between study techniques we enjoy using and study techniques which are actually useful based on scientific evidence. Like, I enjoy making notes, but I know that they're not actually that effective in helping me learn. And I can still make notes, especially if it makes studying more fun for me. But it's just important to weave in things which are actually working for the goals that I have. Oh my god, look at this little random lens flare rainbow going on. It really said, Jade, you are casual magic tier, so thank you, light. I also want to say that most studies clarify that their conclusions are not always generalizable across all contexts, all people, so even though techniques are evidence-based, it might not work for everyone. So try things out, see what you like to use, see what gets you the results, and I'm so excited for your academic year ahead. I would love to hear your thoughts. I am going into my final year of university next year and I just feel in a good place with how to study. So yeah, you get better over time. Sending you so much love. Bye guys.
So I have two-dimensional vectors right over here. Vector A. So I have So I have two two-dimensional vectors right over here. Vector A and vector B. And what I want to think about is how can we define, or what would be a reasonable way to define the sum of vector A plus vector B? Well, one thing that might jump at your mind is, look, well, each of these are two-dimensional. They both have two components. Why don't we just add the corresponding components? So for this sum, why don't we make the first component of the sum just the sum of the first two components of these two vectors? So why don't we just make it 6 plus negative 4? Well, 6 plus negative 4 is equal to 2. And why don't we just make the second component the sum of the two second components? So negative 2 plus 4 is also equal to 2. So we start with two two-dimensional vectors. You add them together, you get another two two-dimensional vectors. If you think about it in terms of real coordinate spaces, both of these are members of R2. I'll write this down here just so we get used to the notation. So vector A, and vector B are both members of R2, which is just another way of saying that these are both two tuples. They're both two-dimensional vectors right over here. Now, this might make sense just looking at how we represented it, but how does this actually make visual or conceptual sense? And to do that, let's actually plot these vectors. Let's try to represent these vectors in some way. Let's try to visualize them. So vector A, we could visualize. This tells us how far this vector moves in each of these directions, horizontal direction and vertical direction. So if we put I guess you could say the tail of the vector at the origin. Remember, we don't have to put the tail at the origin, but that might make it a little bit easier for us to draw it. We'll go 6 in the horizontal direction, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then negative 2 in the vertical, so negative 2. So vector A could look like this. Vector A looks like that. And once again, the important thing is the magnitude and the direction. The magnitude is represented by the length of this vector, and the direction is the direction that is pointed in. And also, just to emphasize, I could have drawn vector A like that, or I could have put it over here. These are all equivalent vectors. These are all equal to vector A. All I really care about is the magnitude and the direction. So with that in mind, let's also draw vector B. Vector B in the horizontal direction goes negative 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And in the vertical direction goes 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So its tail, if we start at the origin, if its tail is at the origin, its head would be at 4, it would be at negative 4, 4. So let me draw that just like that. So that right over here is vector b. And once again, vector b, we could draw it like that, or we could draw it. So let me copy, let me paste it. So this would also be another way to draw vector b. This would also be another way to draw vector b. Once again, what I really care about is its magnitude and its direction. All of these green vectors have the same magnitude. They all have the same length, and they all have the same direction. So how does the way that I drew vector a and b gel with what its sum is? So let me draw its sum like this. Let me draw its sum in this blue color. So the sum, based on this definition we just used of vector addition, would be 2, 2. So 2, 2. So it would look like this. So how does this make sense? That the sum, that this purple vector plus this green vector is somehow going to be equal to this blue vector. I encourage you to pause the video and think about if that even makes sense. Well, one way to think about it is this first purple vector, it shifts us this much. It takes us from this point to that point. And so if we were to add it, let's start at this point and put the green vector's tail right there and see where it ends up putting us. So the green vector, we already have a version. So once again, we start at the origin. The vector A takes us there. Now let's start over there with the green vector and see where green vector takes us. And this makes sense. Vector A plus vector B. Put the tail of vector B at the head of vector A. So if you were to start at the origin, vector A takes you there. Then if you add on what vector B takes you, it takes you right over there. So relative to the origin, how much did you, I guess you could say, shift? And once again, vectors don't only apply to things like displacement. It can apply to velocity, it can apply to actual acceleration, it can apply to a whole series of things. But when you visualize it this way, you see that it does make complete sense. This blue vector, the sum of the two, is what results where you start with vector A, at that point right over there. Vector A takes you there. Then you take vector B's tail, start over there, and it takes you to the tip of the sum. Now, one question you might be having is, well, vector A plus vector B is this, but what is vector B? What is vector B plus vector A? Plus vector A. Does this still work? Well, based on the definition we had, where you add the corresponding components, you're still going to get the same sum vector, so it should come out the same. So this will just be negative 4 plus 6 is 2. 4 plus negative 2 is 2. But does that make visual sense? So if we start with vector B, so let's say you start right over here. Vector B takes you right over there. And then if you were to go there and you were to start with vector A, so let's do that. So actually, let me make this a little bit. Let me start with a new vector B. So let's say that's our vector B right over there. And then let me give this a place where I'll have some space to work with. So let's say that's my vector B right over there. And then let me get a copy of the vector A. That's a good one. So copy, and let me paste it. So I could put vector A's tail at the tip of vector B, and then it'll take me right over there. So if I start here, if I start right over here, vector B takes me there, and now I'm adding to that vector A, which will take me, starting here, will take me there. And so from my original starting position, I have gone this far. Now what is this vector? Well, this is exactly the vector 2, 2, or another way of thinking about it. This vector shifts you 2 in the horizontal direction and 2 in the vertical direction. So either way, you're going to get the same result, and that should hopefully make visual or conceptual sense as well.
This is a little bit different from the physics student perspective, where vectors can by looking at a few examples. The fundamental, root of it all building block for linear algebra is the vector. So it's worth making sure that we're all on the same page about what exactly a vector is. You see, broadly speaking, there are three distinct but related ideas about vectors, which I'll call the physics student perspective, the computer science student perspective, and the mathematician's perspective. The physics student perspective is that vectors are arrows pointing in space. What defines a given vector is its length and the direction it's pointing. But as long as those two facts are the same, you can move it all around and it's still the same vector. Vectors that live in the flat plane are two-dimensional, and those sitting in broader space that you and I live in are three-dimensional. The computer science perspective is that vectors are ordered lists of numbers. For example, let's say you were doing some analytics about house prices, and the only features you cared about were square footage and price. You might model each house with a pair of numbers, the first indicating square footage and the second indicating price. Notice the order matters here. In the lingo, you'd be modeling houses as two-dimensional vectors, where in this context, vector is pretty much just a fancy word for list, and what makes it two-dimensional is the fact that the length of that list is 2. The mathematician, on the other hand, seeks to generalize both these views, basically saying that a vector can be anything where there's a sensible notion of adding two vectors and multiplying a vector by a number, operations that I'll talk about later on in this video. The details of this view are rather abstract, and I actually think it's healthy to ignore it until the last video of this series, favoring a more concrete setting in the interim. But the reason I bring it up here is that it hints at the fact that the ideas of vector addition and multiplication by numbers will play an important role throughout linear algebra. But before I talk about those operations, let's just settle in on a specific thought to have in mind when I say the word vector. Given the geometric focus that I'm shooting for here, whenever I introduce a new topic involving vectors, I want you to first think about an arrow, and specifically, think about that arrow inside a coordinate system, like the xy plane, with its tail sitting at the origin. This is a little bit different from the physics student perspective, where vectors can freely sit anywhere they want in space. In linear algebra, it's almost always the case that your vector will be rooted at the origin. Then, once you understand a new concept in the context of arrows in space, we'll translate it over to the list of numbers point of view, which we can do by considering the coordinates of the vector. Now, while I'm sure that many of you are already familiar with this coordinate system, it's worth walking through explicitly, since this is where all of the important back and forth happens between the two perspectives of linear algebra. Focusing our attention on two dimensions for the moment, you have a horizontal line, called the x-axis, and a vertical line, called the y-axis. The place where they intersect is called the origin, which you should think of as the center of space and the root of all vectors. After choosing an arbitrary length to represent 1, you make tick marks on each axis to represent this distance. When I want to convey the idea of 2D space as a whole, which you'll see comes up a lot in these videos, I'll extend these tick marks to make grid lines, but right now they'll actually get a little bit in the way. The coordinates of a vector is a pair of numbers that basically gives instructions for how to get from the tail of that vector at the origin to its tip. The first number tells you how far to walk along the x-axis, positive numbers indicating rightward motion, negative numbers indicating leftward motion, and the second number tells you how far to walk parallel to the y-axis after that, positive numbers indicating upward motion, and negative numbers indicating downward motion. To distinguish vectors from points, the convention is to write this pair of numbers vertically, with square brackets around them. Every pair of numbers gives you one and only one vector, and every vector is associated with one and only one pair of numbers. What about in 3 dimensions? Well, you add a third axis, called the z-axis, which is perpendicular to both the x and y axes, and in this case, each vector is associated with an ordered triplet of numbers. The first tells you how far to move along the x-axis, the second tells you how far to move parallel to the y-axis, and the third one tells you how far to then move parallel to this new z-axis. Every triplet of numbers gives you one unique vector in space, and every vector in space gives you exactly one triplet of numbers. Alright, so back to vector addition and multiplication by numbers. After all, every topic in linear algebra is going to center around these two operations. Luckily, each one's pretty straightforward to define. Let's say we have two vectors, one pointing up and a little to the right, and the other one pointing right and down a bit. To add these two vectors, move the second one so that its tail sits at the tip of the first one. Then, if you draw a new vector from the tail of the first one to where the tip of the second one now sits, that new vector is their sum. This definition of addition, by the way, is pretty much the only time in linear algebra where we let vectors stray away from the origin. Now, why is this a reasonable thing to do? Why this definition of addition and not some other one? Well, the way I like to think about it is that each vector represents a certain movement, a step with a certain distance and direction in space. If you take a step along the first vector, then take a step in the direction and distance described by the second vector, the overall effect is just the same as if you moved along the sum of those two vectors to start with. You could think about this as an extension of how we think about adding numbers on a number line. One way that we teach kids to think about this, say with 2 plus 5, is to think of moving 2 steps to the right, followed by another 5 steps to the right. The overall effect is the same as if you just took 7 steps to the right. In fact, let's see how vector addition looks numerically. The first vector here has coordinates 1, 2. And the second one has coordinates 3, -1. When you take the vector sum using this tip-to-tail method, you can think of a 4-step path from the origin to the tip of the second vector. Walk 1 to the right, then 2 up, then 3 to the right, then 1 down. Reorganizing these steps so that you first do all of the rightward motion, then do all the vertical motion, you can read it as saying 1. The overall effect is the same as if you just took 7 steps to the right. In fact, let's see how vector addition looks numerically. The first vector here has coordinates 1, 2. And the second one has coordinates 3, -1. When you take the vector sum using this tip-to-tail method, you can think of a 4-step path from the origin to the tip of the second vector. Walk 1 to the right, then 2 up, then 3 to the right, then 1 down. Reorganizing these steps so that you first do all of the rightward motion, then do all the vertical motion, you can read it as saying, first move 1 plus 3 to the right, then move 2 minus 1 up. So the new vector has coordinates 1 plus 3 and 2 plus -1. In general, vector addition in this list of numbers conception looks like matching up their terms and adding each one together. The other fundamental vector operation is multiplication by a number. Now this is best understood just by looking at a few examples. If you take the number 2 and multiply it by a given vector, it means you stretch out that vector so that it's 2 times as long as when you started. If you multiply that vector by, say, 1/3, it means you squish it down so that it's 1/3 the original length. When you multiply it by a negative number, like -1.8, then the vector first gets flipped around, then stretched out by that factor of 1.8. This process of stretching or squishing or sometimes reversing the direction of a vector is called scaling. And whenever you catch a number, like 2 or 1/3 or -1.8, acting like this, scaling some vector, you call it a scalar. In fact, throughout linear algebra, one of the main things that numbers do is scale vectors, so it's common to use the word scalar pretty much interchangeably with the word number. Numerically, stretching out a vector by a factor of, say, 2, corresponds with multiplying each of its components by that factor, 2. So in the conception of vectors as lists of numbers, multiplying a given vector by a scalar means multiplying each one of those components by that scalar. You'll see in the following videos what I mean when I say that linear algebra topics tend to revolve around these two fundamental operations, vector addition and scalar multiplication. And I'll talk more in the last video about how and why the mathematician thinks only about these operations, independent and abstracted away from however you choose to represent vectors. In truth, it doesn't matter whether you think about vectors as fundamentally being arrows in space, like I'm suggesting you do, that happen to have a nice numerical representation, or fundamentally as lists of numbers that happen to have a nice geometric interpretation. The usefulness of linear algebra has less to do with either one of these views than it does with the ability to translate back and forth between them. It gives the data analyst a nice way to conceptualize many lists of numbers in a visual way, which can seriously clarify patterns in data and give a global view of what certain operations do. And on the flip side, it gives people like physicists and computer graphics programmers a language to describe space and the manipulation of space using numbers that can be crunched and run through a computer. When I do mathy animations, for example, I start by thinking about what's actually going on in space and then get the computer to represent things numerically, thereby figuring out where to place the pixels on the screen. And doing that usually relies on a lot of linear algebra understanding. So there are your vector basics, and in the numbers that can be crunched and run through a computer. When I do mathy animations, for example, I start by thinking about what's actually going on in space and then get the computer to represent things numerically, thereby figuring out where to place the pixels on the screen. And doing that usually relies on a lot of linear algebra understanding. So there are your vector basics, and in the next video, I'll start getting into some pretty neat concepts surrounding vectors, like span, bases, and linear dependence. See you then!